Hello there, it's great to have you with me as we do another brief devotional study of one of the Psalms. I often take the opportunity, as I will do just now, to remind you that these are not meant to be detailed expositions of every point in a psalm. We're not able to do that in these brief minutes, but the idea is just to give you a devotional overview of its structure and its burden, and perhaps one or two keys that will help you to get into the psalm and appreciate it all the more for yourself. We often tend to think in terms of the Psalms as devotional, giving us language in which we can praise and pray and lament. We often comment on the way that it reflects every human emotion and experience, and so it does. But what we don't speak of so often with regard to the Psalms is their theological content. And yet almost every biblical doctrine is alluded to, at least, somewhere in the contents of the Psalter. Indeed, a contemporary of one of the early church fathers described the Psalms as, quote, a compendium of theology. We've got to Psalm 76 in our journey through the Psalms, and this psalm addresses one of the most foundational doctrines of all, the fact that God is a God of self-revelation. Way back in the 1970s, Francis Schaeffer famously said of God, "He is there and he is not silent." A decade earlier, Jim Packer wrote the classic book, God Has Spoken. And the reality is that if God had not chosen to be known by men and women, then despite all our best efforts and all our knowledge of ourselves, we would and could never have come to know him. God by his nature is invisible, he's unknowable, he's unapproachable in his holiness. And all that we know of him, or can know of him, is only that which he has revealed of himself to us. And Asaph, as he writes Psalm 76, speaks to that fact head on in two particularly powerful ways. First of all, in verses 1 to 3, we learn that God is known in Judah, the covenant people of God. The Old Testament tells us that God chose Abraham, and from Abraham he chose the Jewish nation as a people to whom he would bind himself in a covenant and through whom he would be made known to the whole world. So in the Old Testament, if you want to know God, you look at the nation of Israel. And that, of course, was why God so often had to discipline his people, because by their rebelliousness and their sin, they failed to be that visible representation of the true and living God. They failed in the very purpose for their existence. Now, while I don't sign up to a sort of replacement theology position regarding the church in Israel, we could still say the same about the church today. In the church, God is, or at least should be, known. That's a momentous responsibility, isn't it? As well as a glorious privilege. We ought to be able to say, in the church, God is known. His name is great in the church. We are to be communities of grace which display who God is. I think it was Mark Dever in the States who said, the church is the gospel made visible. See, there's a sense in which we incarnate God in our communities. So, says Asaph here, God is known in Judah. But secondly, and perhaps even more strikingly, God is known in judgment. Verses 4 to 6. But first let me give you a bit of likely background here, which will help us. While no specific event is named in the introduction to this psalm, as is sometimes the case, there is really only one Old Testament event that fits the bill of the total and complete devastation brought about by God on the enemies of his people, as described here in these verses 4 to 6. And that event would be the defeat of the Assyrians, who were besieging Jerusalem, and the deaths of 185,000 soldiers in one night by the angel of the Lord. It's recorded for us at the end of 2 Kings 19. And God makes himself known in the acts of judgment which take place throughout history, as he reminds people who for the most part live without any thought of him, or the thought that there's a day of judgment and reckoning coming that will affect everyone. And yet even the strongest and the bravest collapse before the terrors of the Lord. Look at verses 7 to 9. You who are to be feared, who can stand before you when once your anger is roused? So God makes himself known in Judah, and God makes himself known in judgment. And then in typical Old Testament fashion, Asaph moves from an event in Old Testament history to drawing a lesson from that event, namely, a lesson about the nature of God's judgments. So in verses 7 through to the end of the psalm in verse 12, he tells us specifically what our response should be to such overwhelming and unstoppable divine power. In fact, he says there are two appropriate responses. There's a response of fear, and there's a response of worship. In fact, the word feared comes 4 times in this last section of this psalm. The idea of worship is also spelled out as Asaph calls on men and women to bring their worship and their devotion to God. I wonder, is there not a deliberate, spirit-inspired echo here of Psalm 2? Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. And notice how this short but immensely powerful and forceful psalm ends. You see, it began back in verse 1 with God being known in Judah among his own people. But it closes with him being known to the kings of the whole earth. Verse 12. And he's made himself known to his people. He's made himself known through his acts of judgment. And as a result of those things, the world comes to know about our God. Let's seek God's help to be these communities who incarnate God himself, and who, by the way we live out our personal and corporate lives, we reflect the glory and the majesty, as well as the severity and the holiness of the God whom we seek to represent. The Lord bless you. Please join me next time as we look at Psalm 77.